Hello, I'm David Morris. So what's going on? The world has turned away from globalization that so many people around the world were so excited about in the 1990s and early 2000s. There was this imagination that there was an inevitable move towards a global community, free trade, that developing countries would become richer. And of course, here in Australia, we know that we benefited enormously from the growth of Asia in that period. But since something around the time of the global financial crisis, Americans and many Europeans have turned away from globalization. That interdependence is something that is now seen as a risk, maybe even as a threat. So in chapter 2 that I'm reading from today, my book, A New Era of Risk, and in chapter 2 we probe into this question of how the rise of China is changing everything and how our attitudes in the West towards globalization have changed and how this means we're in a new reality. So probing a bit deeper into this. So looking first at the global disruptions that are generating new risks. After 3 decades of relative peace, stability, development and globalization in most of the post-Cold War world, we're witnessing now in the 2020s a perfect storm of multiple systemic disruptions to the global system, international economy and, of course, to the climate. All of this is happening at the same time. It bears repeating that the sky is changing. Seismic geopolitical change is manifesting in an emerging, likely multipolar international system. Protectionism is returning, sometimes cloaked in national security objectives and sometimes simply brazenly populist, a beggar thy neighbour approach for one side to win against the other. Meanwhile, there is little to no global collaboration, such as to urgently tackle the climate crisis or the need to regulate new technologies to ensure they do not endanger human safety. The complexities and uncertainties of the systemic disruptions that are underway raise serious questions about how international actors can manage risks and seize opportunities as well in the international environment. The new world that is emerging is generating new risks that require a rethink about how international finance, commerce, investment, diplomacy, and all forms of international cooperation function. Confidence in complex interdependence, which is what we used to talk about in the days of globalization, which underpinned the globalization era, this confidence in interdependence, appears to have collapsed in many places. That confidence in interdependence had been built on assumptions that states and international actors could achieve positive sum outcomes from an ongoing process of negotiating rules, norms, and practices, while economies became ever more integrated. And I think it's important to remember that it was a process. It wasn't like you just dropped all your tariffs and you opened up to free trade and everything just worked hunky-dory. Internationalization, globalization, interdependence was a process of constant negotiation, constantly finding areas of common ground and constantly having to negotiate areas where countries, businesses and others had differences of view. So it was a process that was a kind of a cooperative process, a kind of a cooperative economic approach to the world, and I would argue as well a cooperative security approach, because the more economically secure we all are, the less we feel the need to focus on national security. So these things are all wrapped up together. In recent years, populations, even in those countries that had previously championed free trade, such as the US, have become fearful that free trade means negative sum losses to advanced economies and that it benefits only the emerging economies. Now, again, I have to say we in Australia know that actually as a developed economy, we have benefited enormously from our economic integration with East Asia and with Asia more generally, as well as a free trading world. But that's a particularly Aussie perspective, and it isn't widely shared in Europe and America. I lecture at a university in France, And I always ask my students, do you support free trade? Hands up who supports free trade. And last time, in February, I think it was, when I was in France, I asked my students this question. When I said, hands up who supports free trade, not one hand went up. So I think this tells us something, that there is a deep frustration with the global trading system, and there is a deep suspicion that maybe some countries are benefiting more than others. So this is part of the problem, right? Meanwhile, the largest of those emerging economies, and arguably already a new great power, China, is doubling down on its domestic authoritarianism. It's outlining globally its ambitions to remake the international order, making it intrinsically a systematic rival to the great democracies. And at the same time, in those democracies that had formerly written the international relations narratives, trust in internationalism has plummeted, and it's polarised domestic politics as well. In fact, the really only thing that is uniting people is a kind of a populism, either a populism of the right or a populism of the left, ideological competition, confrontation, and even conflict. These trends were amplified by anxieties and challenges generated by the COVID-19 pandemic and its economic impacts. That global crisis was then followed closely by the cascading impacts of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which seemed to confirm both the worst fears and warnings of geopolitical analysts that we were returning to an era of zero-sum competition for global power. Indeed, the 2020s appear to represent the end of an era of optimism about international interdependence and the beginning of a new era of pessimism about risks. So this is where we start digging in, because we're in this period of deep pessimism that maybe interdependence cannot work, which is a fundamental problem if our international economy is integrated, if actually we are deeply integrated, our supply chains are deeply integrated. If we've lost confidence in that, what do we create? How do we manage risks in that situation? So it's timely to understand the new political risks emerging in this new uncertain period of the 2020s and beyond. What's coming next? It is no longer possible for international actors to plan based on an expectation of status quo conditions, rules, institutions, or markets. All of those things are uncertain now in the 2020s. Despite decades of ever more integrated value chains and ever decreasing barriers to trade and investment, today's business world is seeing the rule book rewritten, with supply chains reshaping in response to factors including the new geopolitical contest underway, pandemic, populism, war, climate change, and technological transformation. Generating these new risks to actors in the international economy are global disruptions that require not simplistic answers, but complex understanding, complex scenario planning, and we need to think much more deeply about the interrelated factors that are changing the world at the moment. So that brings me to the section, the new geopolitical risks, US-China contest and unravelling global interdependence. Geopolitical power in the world is shifting, and that is changing the assumptions, rules, and operating environment. China is chief amongst the disruptors to the previously US-led world order. China's ambitious new institution building, its financing of global infrastructure connectivity, and technological innovation are interpreted in the US and its closest allies as strategic threats, while at the same time, much of the developing world is looking to China to benefit from closer integration with what is now the world's largest trading economy. And here's the rub. How China will act as a new great power and how the broader West will react indeed raise questions of risks and opportunities that will likely shape the future of the international system, the international economy, and questions of peace and security for the next decade ahead. One unfolding trend is the escalating use of sanctions deployed by both the US and China against each other and against other adversaries. The US has deployed comprehensive sanctions against China's technology industry, which impact on participants throughout the global value chains for semiconductor chips, which are the building blocks of the next generation technological innovations. Although in recent times, actually since I wrote this book, Donald Trump has actually negotiated and stepped back a little bit in some of those limits on semiconductors, which is very interesting, which indicates perhaps this is less about strategic threat and more about negotiating positions. China, meanwhile, has also placed sanctions in recent years on countries as diverse as Australia, South Korea, and others like Lithuania in Europe, to punish these countries for participation in US-led national security narratives and decision-making and other measures that China perceives as targeted at itself. So China sees these actions being taken and language being used in these countries as directed against China, and China has punished these countries with sanctions as well. With such measures, political risks are arising even in locations previously considered amongst the safest and most prospective for investment and trade. This return to geopolitical power struggle is about more than a simple US-China contest. China is simply the new great power. Russia, once a global power and still potentially a hegemonic actor in Eurasia, has become aggressive once again and has triggered a remarkable strengthening of the West in response, which widely adopted sanctions, and even Sweden and Finland joining the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, to bolster Europe's defence system, just as the US invasion of Iraq 2 decades earlier had ended a period of optimism about a rules-based international security architecture and actually, I think, weakened US normative leadership in the world. Russia's invasion of Ukraine appears to have ended a period of optimism about economic interdependence with authoritarian powers and encouraged many, including in particular newly independent countries of Central Asia, to look elsewhere than Russia for their security and their prosperity. These geopolitical shifts are undermining the complex interdependence of recent decades that we might refer to as globalization. But globalization had delivered record growth across much of the developing world. It had lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty. The concept of interdependence has been a widely used framework for explaining how rules, norms, and practices of international cooperation developed under previous decades of US global leadership. It was in interdependence, consistent with states pursuing their own interests, according to Keohane, the theorist of interdependence, that it was possible to find sufficient common or complementary interests to generate international cooperation, as long as states considered that they would make gains rather than losses from cooperation. And that's the critical issue. If states feel they're making gains, they will negotiate and they will find interdependence. But obviously, as we're seeing in the US, for example, if they feel that they're not gaining from interdependence with other countries, the barriers start to go up. This process of interdependence, as comprehended by Keohane, reduced uncertainty and risk. So we had in the period of globalization reduced uncertainty and risk. This is quickly forgotten, I think. We had lowered transaction costs of decision-making and sustained international cooperation in a never-ending negotiation and process of adjustments, accommodation and coordination with others to pursue positive sum outcomes. This is simplistic, of course, but this is the general idea. This was the general concept of interdependence. While realist scholars expected states to more often pursue conflict in this Hobbesian chaos, a theory which appeared to be borne out by the geopolitical confrontation and conflicts of the Cold War, and is encouraging today's return to geopolitics, Keohane's theory of interdependence helped us to understand how most of the time in the post-Cold War period of US global leadership, states actually sought institutionalized patterns of cooperation through institutions and agreed rules, norms and procedures for negotiation. What we used to call, and perhaps still might, call a rules-based order, a rules-based economic order in particular. Deepening and broadening global interdependence was widely considered an unstoppable megatrend during the most recent incarnation of world order from around 1989 until around 2020, the most recent period of globalization. That period saw accelerating international financial flows, increasing integration of national economies into global value chains, technological transformation, notably information in exponentially greater volumes and speed, and increasing movement of people as well. So all of those things were changing, all pointing to the potential dominance of economic cooperation over security competition across much of the world. Not all of the world, of course. Of course, there were exceptions and there were terrible conflicts in this period, but as a generalisation, that period of interdependence was actually delivering better lives for most people in the world. Maybe not in some places, though, and we'll come back to that. So, leadership strategies in Asia also played a central role in the globalisation process, and therefore the post-Cold War period should be understood as exhibiting a blend of not only US leadership but Asian leadership as well, with international ramifications. Now, this is an important point that I like to make and that I think only Asian scholars tend to make. I like to think as an Australian that I'm in the Asian region, and I agree with this point that Asian scholars, Mahbubani and others make, and that is that Asia really was a leader in this period of globalisation. It was the embrace of free trade, the embrace of global value chains, the integration into the global economy of the East Asian markets of Japan, Korea, of course giant China and others. This is what drove the period of globalisation. So it's often understood in the West to be an American-led process, and it certainly was under the US leadership of the post-Cold War world. It certainly was consistent with the language that the US was talking, but the action was in Asia. Key East Asian states adopted their own models, actually. It was quite different from the US model. They adopted state-driven investment and trade-focused development models that integrated their growing economies into global value chains, epitomising interdependence and underpinning the global trends of free flows of investment and trade. The remarkable and rapid economic modernisation in East Asia was based on an embrace of some, but not all, the principles of the so-called Washington Consensus that urged developing countries to adopt market-oriented strategies. Asian leaders privileged pragmatism over theory, allowing for the state to judge the appropriate pace of reform and the role of government in providing stability, infrastructure, education, industry planning, and distributional aspects to manage change. This was an Asian model. At the same time, most East Asian economies embraced low tariffs and openness to foreign investment to attract capital and technology to develop globally competitive export industries, taking advantage of surplus labour as their economies shifted from agriculture to manufacturing and then to services. The unprecedented East Asian economic expansion, globalization's race to the top, created an Asian middle class of more than 1 billion people. Central to this East Asian development phenomenon was the post-1978 reform and opening up of China, with its own adapted version of the East Asian development model, culminating in its membership of the new World Trade Organization in 2001, at the high point of optimism about globalising trade and investment. Critically viewed from East Asia, this period of growing interdependence and globalisation was underpinned by regional peace, in which geopolitical discourses were often eclipsed, in elite circles at least, by the perspectives of business strategists. People were reading business strategists. They were not reading war theorists so much in this optimistic period of globalisation. These East Asian development strategies were further positioned within an open regionalism of flexible overlapping agreements on economic integration. So here in the Asia-Pacific, we had Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation, APEC, which Australia had championed as well, right through to the recently signed Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, which is the world's biggest free trade area, and of course the Comprehensive and Progressive Trans-Pacific Partnership. All of these signalling broad commitment by their members, chiefly nations in East Asia, to geo-economic interdependence. The countries of the region displaying a tolerance for multipolarity, for complexity, for ambiguity and diverse political models, and indeed featuring a diversity of economic development from rich countries to poor countries, some resource-rich and others relying on their human capital. All of these countries innovated in their international relationships by building flexible, overlapping regional platforms for cooperation to nurture their interdependence. This was an Asian story, and it was a story of benefits in Asia, strong benefits in Asia, perhaps the benefits not so strongly felt in the broader West, in the US and in Europe. This pragmatic East Asian regionalism diverged dramatically from the deep universalist political and values-driven integration project that was going on in Europe, the European Union, and is therefore the Asian model has been commonly overlooked in the Western literature and perhaps explains the absence of the Asian story generally in understanding globalization. Yet I would argue Asia was central to the globalization period. Asia's external focus on regional integration with the global economy nevertheless can be considered to have generated, I think, its own leadership model for regional and global interdependence, making East Asia the first of what we might call a global region. The Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN itself, at the centre of all of this, while it has taken steps to formalise its economic harmonisation, remains chiefly an informal mechanism between dramatically diverse states. These countries are very different. So ASEAN itself has relatively few codified conventions considered by Southeast Asian decision makers as being fit for purpose, for pragmatic problem solving based on an assumption of diversity and rooted in the principle of state sovereignty. And indeed, the ASEAN way, as it's called, has institutionalised a non-interventionist philosophy in a region that once experienced regular intervention by external powers, and the recent experience of peace in the region had encouraged a degree of confidence that there may be less conflict between the states as they became more economically interdependent and would deliver mutual benefits. So here's the thing, that the economic interdependence and the rising wealth of Asia was happening at a time of peace. And so there was this very optimistic narrative in Asia right up until the time the narrative changed in the West. Nevertheless, the Asia-Pacific, the emerging hub of the world economy and therefore fundamental to our understanding of the new political risks, does remain marked by enduring rivalries, and there are geopolitical tensions, of course. Not only does China aspire to greater regional and global leadership, but India aspires to also become a major power. Japan continues to consider a less defensive posture than the one that was imposed upon it by the US after World War II, and Indonesia, Bangladesh, Vietnam and others are following similar growth and development paths as the earlier East Asian success stories. And so even though their development over the years ahead may not be as dramatic as China, nevertheless all of these countries are rising. All of these countries have large populations and they'll be more significant in the future. So finding a way for them to remain economically interdependent and at peace is going to be the question for Asia and for the world, I think. I've lost my place here. East Asia was the location of some of the hottest conflicts during the Cold War. The so-called Cold War was not so cold in Asia, and it still features key flashpoints, making it remarkable that the region nevertheless enjoyed relative peace during the decades of deepening interdependence. While China settled most of its land border disputes, formalised through the establishment of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, it continues to have serious maritime disputes with numerous Asian powers, including its controversial claims to much of the South China Sea. Other key regional flashpoints remain on the Korean Peninsula, in the Taiwan Strait, of course, and in a number of enduring domestic conflicts, such as within Myanmar. So Asia has its problems, for sure. It has its tensions. Those regional actors that are integrated into Western security alliances, including Japan, South Korea and Australia, ascribe the peace of recent decades to the geopolitical imbalance, you could say, or balance, assured by overwhelming US military superiority and capabilities across the region. And so those countries have traditionally feared a resurgent China. Now, these countries will support, I have no doubt, a continued US military presence, which in turn will be resisted by China. So that's a tension. Other regional leaders resist these binary narratives. Within the Asia-Pacific region, then, there are dual trends towards a realist balancing geopolitics, and at the same time other countries pursuing multipolar geoeconomic interdependence, and actually a bit of both quite often, and that's important to understand. It should be noted that notwithstanding the emergence of Asia's massive middle class, the regional growth story masks significant internal risks of future social discord and political crises, given the region's youthful populations but ageing leaders, often corrupt and potentially fragile authoritarianisms across the region, and a rapacious billionaire elite presiding over ever-deepening inequalities. So there are lots of problems in Asia. So the big picture of economic growth might be great, but there are nevertheless serious tensions beneath. China's rapid rise is changing not only the regional but the global balance, and inevitably this has generated geopolitical responses even to what may, in many cases, to date at least, have been primarily geoeconomic initiatives. The rise of China and its impact in the regional and world system became particularly prominent in the international economic discourse by the time of the financial crises in the US and Europe in 2008, during which Chinese investment in the US and Europe actually sustained global financial stability. For the first time in decades, the US found itself facing a peer competitor, a major power with capabilities and intent to become a leading player in the global economy, and with potential to build commensurate power in the international system. This had the effect of sweeping away decades of confidence about interdependence. Whether the world is returning to a bipolar Cold War, as popularly portrayed in the media discourses, however, remains unclear. This discussion of trends in East Asia suggests that a multiplex, perhaps, without a hegemon, may evolve from the complexity of global interdependence, with diverse sources of power, as well as the potentially resilient norm-setting power of regional institutions. The shape of the evolving world order remains uncertain. So optimism about globalization in the West prevailed only while the US remained the unchallenged leader of the international system. Disillusionment with globalization and a populist return to economic nationalism became a dominant theme in the election of Donald Trump as US president, the UK's Brexit from the EU, and other similar nationalist, populist trends across many other liberal democracies as well. It was not confined, however, to the democracies. Pessimism about the long-term health of globalization was also mirrored in China's Xi Jinping, switching focus from global integration to at least an equal goal of national self-reliance in his dual circulation strategy, backed by a more nationalist and ideological agenda. In India and other members of the developing world, nationalism was also stoked during the COVID-19 pandemic, including dangerously raising of trade barriers for important medical supplies and equipment. Now, I'm going to leave it there for today, but I'm going to continue on this chapter in our next episode, so come back. Look forward to continuing the reading next time. Thank you.